Hello and welcome to Mjolnir the Movies. This is the first Mjolnir the Movies of the new year. And with me, as ever, is James. Hello, James.
Hello.
And sadly, Neil is not with us and won't be with us for the foreseeable future, unfortunately, because he has other things to do and he's concentrating on those. But we wish him well and hope he will come back to us sometime in the future.
Yeah.
On with this particular show. This is going to be on Metropolis. We're on episode 28 now, and this is Metropolis, which is, I suppose, the granddaddy of science fiction films, really, in a way. I certainly see this as probably one of the first proper science fiction films. I know you have Georges Méliès's Voyage to the Moon or whatever, but that to me is more fantasy than science fiction. This is a proper hardcore science fiction film, really, and a German expressionist film. What are your first thoughts on it, really? I suppose we'd better look at some of the things that it influenced afterwards. This film influences an awful lot of the cinema that comes afterwards, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's the most telling thing about this with our magic eye from the future. Looking back at this is how much it influenced, and really why you're correct in saying this is the granddaddy of them all. Because other films that people might say, but this had an example of science fiction before it. Well, you say, well, what's referencing it? What did it influence? This one, you'll see the influence almost right away as a modern viewer, because you'll see the later echoes of it in all your modern media.
Absolutely, yeah. Just thinking about some of the films that it influenced, Blade Runner's the obvious one.
Yeah. Star Wars.
Yeah. Basically, a lot of films that have robots in them are influenced by this. Batman, Tim Burton's Batman, thinking about it. We'll get on to that, actually, because right at the end, if you look at this film, which is the ending in the Gothic cathedral, that is pretty much carbon copied by Tim Burton for the film Batman.
Because that's the thing, a lot of this will be the cinematic and artistic styles that will influence things, and other things will take from the themes and story, but the influences are still there. There's multiple of them across time.
Yeah. Dark City, which we've looked at as well, was heavily influenced by this film and by German expressionism in general. We ought to get on to expressionism, actually, and try to pin down what makes a film expressionist. Did you look at expressionism in art in general at all?
I've looked at a few, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert in these things. I wouldn't dare write an essay or speech right now on these things.
Yeah, but just looking at the principles of expressionism, both in art, particularly in theatre as well.
Especially in silent films, you'll see a lot of it in the silent film era.
That's right, particularly Germany of the 1920s where we're at, particularly films by Erich Pommer. I mean, the screenplay of Metropolis is dedicated to Erich Pommer, who was the producer of this film.
And a lot of horror as well, not just science fiction, but you'll see this in a lot of horror.
Yeah. And Pommer is regarded as the father of German expressionism, and he produced films like Der letzte Mann, and am I right in saying that he also produced The Cabinet of Dr. Kalergi and Nosferatu as well, if I remember rightly? A lot of those films by the likes of Murnau and those kind of people that start off sort of 1910s and 1920s, they all encompass the ideas of expressionism, both in terms of pictorial art. Looking at pictorial art in terms of expressionism, what makes it expressionist? Well, it's an attempt to get feelings on the canvas, really. Not just any old feelings, but extreme, profound feelings, particularly almost hysterical, emotional ones, actually, when one looks at it. And so then you get things like extremely angular scenery and also camera angles and so on and so forth. You got that a lot in Dark City. Yeah. I don't know if you noticed when they were reaching the edge of the city and the doctor, was it Schrader, if I remember rightly, he was getting more and more hysterical. And the whole architecture was jutting out at odd angles and things like that. And this is what you get in expressionism. So you get kind of extremes. This also fits into certain architectural ideas of the 1920s, actually.
It's interesting that it's something that a lot of filmmakers now wouldn't dare to do, because there's this strong push in every media for realism and photorealism.
That's right, yeah. This is very much stylized, and I like that about films that dare to be stylized and to be stylish and to have a certain look to them, and to try to communicate certain feelings and certain ideas and have certain symbolism in them.
I think that's a mistake a lot of franchises as well do, where some of the sort of long-running franchises try to keep themselves up to date with modern thinking and modern technology. Maybe they feel something's anachronistic over time. I think that's a mistake, to constantly play catch-up and constantly change your vision or your design or the theme of it to try and play to whatever the current norm is, because you end up with something that's so ephemeral it becomes nothing. It's constantly changing what's going to be left.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, if you look at cinema now, beyond the SJW politics and everything, what we don't like, of course, one thing that I really dislike about it is its banality. It's so ordinary. It tries to make up for things with special effects and so on. But this is all just ephemeral nonsense, really. It doesn't have any profundity to it. It doesn't add anything to the meaning, because ultimately what we're being sold is meaninglessness. Coming back to this film is a unity, and it's a whole of everything, really, where the aesthetics mirror emotions and the camera angles and so on, and the stylized nature of it, which also ties into the thematics of it and the plot and so on. And it all comes together very well.
Very obvious dedication to everything being made to fit the aesthetics and what the ideas and themes it's meant to show. There's even examples in the title cards. The title cards actually change shape and the way they move to suit the message being given.
Yeah.
Not seen that in some other silent films I've seen, which might just show up a standard title card. But this one, the way it does it, it'll actually give you ideas subconsciously through the way the text scrolls, through the shape that the text conforms to on the screen.
Yes, like when they have the rolling card, of course.
To tell you, down below. And of course the text moves down below, spaced heavily to give it emphasis and sort of gravitas. It's large spaces. And then when it talks about up above in the Tower of Babel, the text is in the shape of this pyramid, this tower, closely cramped together, and it moves up to tell you, oh, we're going up now. That's a kind of complete vision that really is some craft.
Yeah, that's right. Everything's been thought of. There's a certain amount of theatricality to it as well, which comes from the stage rather than from the screen. Because, of course, this is a silent film, so you're limited because you haven't got dialogue, of course. But there are other things that you can do to compensate for that, things that have been forgotten, sadly, with the advent of talkies. People have forgotten the theatricality of certain things, whereby you have to exaggerate motion and stuff like that. Things like when the workers go into the lift as they're going to work, and they're all there sort of in ranks of people, completely uniform, with their heads bent, shuffling in unison. One go into the lift as the other shift comes out. And this is all sort of choreographed so well.
I think that's something that people that aren't familiar with silent films, or this one in particular, should keep in mind going into it, is sort of go to watch it as if you're going to go to a play. You're going to see something on stage, and then it won't feel so strange, because I know a lot of people have trouble with anything that's of that vintage, because there's a kind of alien form to it almost for screen. But if you go to it with in mind thinking that you're going to see a play, then it actually feels a lot more natural, because you're still used to seeing plays with these standard forms of expressing yourself, because you've got to do that way on a stage when people are sitting at a minimum several meters away.
Yeah. Another one of the great performances in the film that show this is the performance by Brigitte Helm, who plays a double role, actually, of Maria both the real Maria and the false Maria that we'll come on to. When she's being chased by Rotvang and she's cornered and she starts shaking, and she does a very theatrical thing from the theatre, which is to put her hands across and shake the hands so that it emphasizes the fact that she's afraid. These things are never done anymore because they would seem, I suppose, in the advent of realistic kind of acting and almost method acting, these things have been lost and now they seem quite ridiculous sometimes. But in this, because it's a silent film and of its time, they don't.
Although it's a different form in these silent films, but the tradition of these signals to the audience goes right back to Greek theatre and probably before recorded history.
Absolutely right, yes. Absolutely right. And sadly, these things have been lost from filmmaking, and you've got to really go into the theatres now to see these things. But sadly, who goes to the theatre now? Are the plays that are being produced now any good? They're not. That's why only a few people, a certain bourgeois elite of people, go in to watch plays now because they're utterly crap, really. Beckett, for example, who would want to watch a play by Beckett? I want to get people in the comments saying that, oh, Beckett was a genius, and so how can you say that? No, he was a nihilist, and he completely wanted to rip up the rule book of the theatre just for his own amusement. And he plays with language, and it's all very sort of intellectualized. But does it really mean anything to the common man's experience, to ordinary people's experience, to even higher people's experiences? Not really, not unless you're a complete and total nihilist. And that's the problem with theatre.
And even the things that are known successes and respected, like Shakespeare's works, they try and corrupt and twist and remold.
Yeah, that's right. The fact that nowadays they have, Portia and a merchant of Venice apologize for the Holocaust, or in works by Mozart, where, in Così fan tutte or whatever, they have a urinal on the stage, which is a reference, of course, to a certain artist from Normandy who put a urinal on stage and called it a fountain. Dear. But anyway. Coming back to Metropolis, we ought to, I suppose, start with the plot and give people who haven't seen this film a bit of an idea of what it's all about. Let's start with the setting for a start, because this is a futuristic setting. It is a science fiction film, and it is set in the future.
Fantastic example of what people would call now retrofuturism.
Yes, very much so. And this has come back into vogue, of course, particularly by things like steampunk and diesel punk and this sort of almost cosplay kind of subculture that's come into fashion. And this is pretty much it. This would, if it were made now, probably be very much probably a mixture of steampunk and diesel punk, really.
And it's such a good example because it is so complete. You get to see the workers' lives, you get to see the underground, the rich people's lives, you get to see so much in this reasonably described as epic film.
You get very much a good idea of what the society is like. You get certain settings. So you get the workers' town, which is underground. They obviously don't see daylight. You get the bourgeois class, an idea about how they live. They live in apartments and they go to these eternal gardens where they have pussy on tap and so on. And for even sort of, how can we say, more decadent things, they go to Yoshiwara, which is this gentleman's club. Do you know what Yoshiwara is?
Only because I looked it up not long before this.
Well, a Japanese friend of mine told me what it was many years ago. So
I'll let you tell it then.
Well, it was the red light district in Tokyo. So that's
a bit of a surprise when I found that out.
Yeah, very interesting actually, because when you get to Yoshiwara, did you notice that suddenly there's all these Oriental and black faces, looking lasciviously and and with evil intent and with very decadent looking and everything.
But you don't see anyone else, including the worker zone or the upper class zones.
That's right, and used as a critique. I thought that was very interesting. It's very odd, actually. I view this film as a very rightist film. in many ways.
Even though it was allegedly threatened and criticised for its the opposite.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. We have to mention, of course, the two people who made the film, which was Fritz Lang and his then wife, Thea von Harbou. Thea von Harbou was a member of the National Socialist Party.
And she also was married to one of the lead actors in this as well before, which is a bit weird.
Yes, that's right. And Lang, of course, was half Jewish. And very strange when you think about it. So there's Thea von Harbou, a member of the NSDAP, and there's Fritz Lang, who's half Jewish. But interestingly, Goebbels actually offered Fritz Lang the directorship of Universum Film AG, or UFA as it's called, which was the studio who created this film, and was very much, when it was sort of taken over by the German National Socialists, because everything was pretty much run by the party after 1933, and Fritz Lang was offered the directorship, in spite of him being half Jewish, by Joseph Goebbels, which is very interesting. So the vision that we have of National Socialist Germany is not really that authentic, to be honest.
There's a bit of caricaturing.
Yes, exactly. Although, here's the thing, actually, this is not to give it any credit, because I think that personally, in some ways, it was too liberal, and in other ways, it wasn't liberal enough. In terms of racialism, I think it was too liberal. Whereas I think in terms of culture, I think that it wasn't liberal enough. So there we go. But yes, Lang, of course, turned it down and went off and did films in Hollywood. But it just shows you. And often Fritz Lang gets too much credit for this film, whereas Thea von Harbou is often relegated to having certain mentions, and it's regarded as Fritz Lang's film, but not really, because Thea von Harbou wrote the novel Metropolis, of course, and wrote the script.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that a screenplay writer has obviously a huge amount of impact on a film. It's a shame if somebody wrote a screenplay to just lump all the credit onto a director alone. Not that the director didn't play a huge part, because we've mentioned obviously such amazing attention to detail and things which didn't come from a screenplay, but a screenplay writer's obviously a partner in these things.
Yeah, and even actors.
It's also, for the ladies, it's a good example of a very successful creative woman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than some sort of false modern feminist type promoting up people that don't deserve it, here's somebody that does deserve credit.
Yeah, even though, again, I would criticize her liberalism. She ended up with some Indian guy. So anyway. But anyway, certainly she was very creative. There can be no doubt about that. Filmmaking is very much an ensemble piece, and the director gets far too much credit, as though he's the only one who counts. I ought to mention here the backgrounds and the models, which were designed by Eric Kettelhut.
Absolutely incredible sets. If somebody hasn't watched this, that's probably something that will strike them when they do. It's the sheer scale of this film, the numbers of people in scenes, and the scale of the sets and the props. It's incredible. You can see why it cost the money it did.
Yeah, well, it went way over budget, of course, didn't it?
Millions and millions even back then.
Yeah, it was originally due to be 800,000 marks, and eventually it cost 3.5 million, which was quite a sum of money back then.
Yeah, especially as, from what I can see, it only made a few thousand at the box office.
Yeah. The models as well, it was sort of done in stop animation. So in other words, like with the cars moving and everything at a distance, that was really done, they pushed them a bit and then
I saw some behind the scenes photos.
So on.
I saw some behind the scenes photos with them moving them with wooden dowling. Just nudging every one of the cars along. Fantastic effort. Because when you watch it on screen, you think they were actually all motorised or like slot cars, because it's so nicely done.
Yeah, we ought to mention as well how they created these amazing models, this cityscape. That was really done looking at all these architectural theorists and new architects and projecting that into the future. So, for example, there was a big influence of Bauhaus, of course. And on the post-Bauhaus group called Der Ring, which were people like Erich Mendelssohn, Ludwig Mies von der Rohe, and Walter Gropius. And these very much influenced the architecture of New York, funnily enough. So New York was a big influence as well, because it was, of course, everything was new in New York. All these big skyscrapers were being put up and so on. Another big influence was the French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier. And he had some radical theories on, I think they called the 5 points of architecture, if I remember rightly. Things like getting rid of supporting walls and replacing them with reinforced concrete columns. There's a lot of concrete involved in Le Corbusier's architectural ideas. He's one of these big reformers from which we get all these sort of ideas that have dominated 20th century architecture, particularly brutalism and so on, and even deconstructivism. There is a deconstructivist theory of architecture, believe it or not. People ought to look at some of the designs based on the deconstructivist school. These are the ones that often get criticized by the likes of Roger Scruton and so on, who has just died, of course. But yeah, other things about the 5 points of architecture, like basically open plan, big sort of halls and things, separating the exterior from structural functionality and so on, and big horizontal windows, rooftop gardens, that kind of thing, and very sort of based on symmetrical ideas, straight lines, that kind of stuff. Sort of very inorganic when you think of it.
Which is very clever if you're trying to come up with some vision for your futuristic setting to tap into these sources. You're tapping into something that is, I suppose, technically current, but it's people on the margins that haven't been maybe accepted quite yet.
Mm.
And it gives the whole thing this futuristic feel at the time and probably quite some time after. And even now, it's still, although it's a retro futurism, it still has that very interesting look. Of course, now people might unfortunately identify some of the aesthetics with some unfortunate periods in history, but also thanks to America's use of it, it gives it something of a shield, because you'll recognise styles on, as you said, New York, some of the iconic buildings there.
Well, one thing I've just thought of that it probably had a huge influence on was were the megacities of Judge Dredd.
Yeah, especially when you look at the cityscape with the Tower of Babel itself and so on, its version of it. You can almost imagine the blocks it had.
Yeah, and the big sort of megways floating around the blocks and everything.
And these roads that just sort of in the sky, way high up, that disappear into the horizon.
Yeah.
There's this roadway just sort of floating there.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, the Tower of Babel itself gets pretty much reused in Blade Runner, doesn't it? There's another thing about that comes in with Blade Runner as well, which I don't know if you noticed, the guy who ran the Eternal Gardens, and he looks very much like Eldon Tyrell. Did you notice that? He was there in the dinner suit with the white bow tie and the octagonal glasses. Did you notice that?
Won't be an accident. That wouldn't be an accident.
No. Absolutely not. No, Ridley Scott's definitely getting a reference in there. But that's that's what artists do. They pay homage to the art that has gone before, and so that's a thing about artistic tradition. And it's a good thing. Now, getting on to the plot. Finally, we got onto the plot.
At last.
Yes, the plot is. In some ways, it's a very simple plot, and in other ways, it's very complex. What do you make of the plot exactly? For a start, for people who haven't seen this film, although we do recommend you go and watch it, and there will be here on it.
Yeah, exactly. The impact of the film and the interest of it. There's a version that's the sort of most restored, and it has a really good soundtrack to it. When you investigate this, you'll find that there's umpteen versions, some of it criminally cut down to like 80 minutes or something, with absurd, inappropriate soundtracks. So try and get I can't remember the name of it, but if you look it up, there is a very highly restored version. It's 90% restored. There's a brief title card moment with a really appropriate soundtrack. Watch that one before you get any spoilers and stuff, because it is a cinematic experience. I know that sounds pretentious, but it's probably one of the few films that you could justify that sort of language.
Yeah, I ought to mention something on the versions, actually. I first saw this film in the 1980s, which was that awful thing that Giorgio Moroder had done to it. Now, I respect Giorgio Moroder as a musician. I think he's done some great stuff. Unfortunately, the Metropolis soundtrack he came up with was not one of them.
Mm.
And I had the misfortune of first encountering this film with that bloody soundtrack on it. And of course, at that time, a lot of the footage was missing. There were big chunks of footage missing. And that was largely because, this film was cut to pieces.
Yeah, we're talking about, when folk in the audience won't realise this, we're talking about versions people would have seen on TV back then. You're talking about an hour, maybe, cut from this, or more. Sometimes it was more than an hour missing from this film. So we're not talking about the director's cut that includes a scene that was superfluous, or 10 minutes here and there, or a different take. We're talking about an hour. And when you watch this film in the 95+% complete, you'll see that, no, you couldn't cut an hour at this reasonably and not miss anything. It's butchered. When you take an hour at this, you're butchering it.
That's right, and it was butchered right from the get-go. This was Channing Pollock who had it cut quite deliberately for Paramount. He thought it was too long, and basically they cut it to pieces. And then the footage was lost for a long, long time. And there were various different versions of it, varying different lengths. And there has been an attempt to piece it all back together. Now, back in, I think it was about 2010, they found a big chunk of it again, which it was very grainy footage, but they decided to put it back in because without it, the film can't be completed, really. And this was found in Argentina, strangely, German cultural artifacts being found in Argentina. Anyway, but so you can tell which ones come from which reel and so on.
But they have over time tried to put in the best quality and then clean it up to try and get it looking consistent. And the current sort of best version, I was really impressed. It's not jarring at all. There's occasional slip-ins of the obviously lower quality, but they framed it in a way to keep it consistent. Don't worry about it if you've not watched it yet. It actually works out fine.
Yeah, well, I had the fortune, actually, of seeing the newly completed version, or almost completed version, because there's still about, 10 minutes left to find or something. But it's as near as damn it recompleted now.
Yeah.
And I had the fortune to see this. It did a tour of the art house cinemas, and I saw it in an art house cinema in France when it was doing the rounds.
Ah, great stuff.
And back, of course, with its original theme. What do you make of the Metropolis theme? It's extraordinarily well done, isn't it?
Yeah, it fits it hand in glove. That's, of course, why it's such a problem for so many versions of the soundtrack to be done. And you can look up lists to see other attempts at it, but you just know that in every country, every year, there'd have been yet another version of the soundtrack, and there was electronic ones, there's been guitar attempts. So many of them just fail. Some of them might actually be interesting for a second viewing to get a different flavour from it, but watch this recreation, the most authentic that you can. Don't go for some weird experimental version or something with some pop music for a first viewing.
Yes. It's very Wagner-like, I think. I think it's, if I remember rightly, it's Gottfried Huppert who composed it.
I mean, you think of the scene with the workers working the frantic and failing machine, which becomes Molech and so on. You couldn't imagine that with a different soundtrack once you've seen it, because it's almost like the sound effects. That's how they work it. It's like the sound effects. That's like rather than the modern Foley sound effects, you've got this orchestra playing, and it fits it perfectly. And not only this what happens in the scene, but obviously also the emotion of the actors is also tied to the music. And that's a good soundtrack.
Yeah, absolutely right. It is perfect. This, to me, there's this guy, he's up there with the likes of John Williams and Ennio Morricone for film soundtracks. He really is. I mean, the music itself is an absolute work of art. It's great. That often makes and breaks a film, actually. If you take the John Williams theme away from Star Wars, it would have been much more mediocre, I think, as a film.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. It's like some of these comedies when you take away the laugh track, how terrible they actually are. If anybody's want just a brief aside, if you can actually find on YouTube Friends without the laugh track, and you'll see just how cringy and awful it is.
I always found Friends cringy and awful.
But without the soundtrack, it's amplified. It's so bad. It's so bad.
And they got the most subversive ideas in a comedy, of course. You know,
always the ideal wedge, the sort of spear point is comedy for anything, isn't it? Really?
Absolutely, yeah. We ought to do a little Mjolnir, the miniseries on Friends, actually, in the future, because that to me shaped consciousness, actually. Back, I mean, what was it, 1990s now?
Well, Friends? I think it went on and on. I think it was over 10 years, so it spanned more than one decade.
Yeah, but it certainly helped to change people's views on certain matters and so on. Because people forget how many viewers that had, and people talked about it all the time. And I think that really revolutionized the consciousness of the 1990s generation in a way that Taxi did in the 1980s.
Yeah, it's another example of why cultural space matters.
Absolutely right, yeah.
It's given across ideas unconsciously or consciously, but nonetheless they get transmitted. No matter what people's opinion on that show is, it was an effective tool for transmitting ideas. And if we ignore that space or surrender that space, somebody else will use it and use it successfully.
Yep. Space always wants to be filled. That's the thing about space, and someone will indeed fill it. But this is coming back to the banality of what we have now. It means that someone can fill that vacuum, and it should be us.
Yeah, if you have something new and exciting, what better environment than one surrounded by mediocrity and repetition?
Yep, absolutely. So, people out there, rightists, writing.
Even the saddest and most dedicated fan, not to put yous down or anything, but the sort of Star Wars, Star Trek fandoms, they're all rebelling because they're begging and would probably accept even a sad echo of what they grew up with and just pay for that. They would just take it gratefully because they're so desperate for something. But even they're disgusted and fed up on the whole because they can't even successfully rehash what came before, partly because of the desperation to force their politics, which ever shift onto people.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not going to deny that we have a certain political angle where even as we're talking about this film, we're looking at this film from the right, but someone should, of course.
No, but we're upfront about it. Anybody that's come this far knows.
Yes, absolutely. But this is the thing about the left. They claim that there's no agenda or anything, when the opposite is absolutely true. Yes, and of course we are working to control the cultural space. Last year, for example, I was involved in a poetry anthology that was run by Christina Finlayson-Taylor, and she edited it, also featured some of her poetry, and she's an extremely good poet. We do have some of the best poets. Julie Howard-Hobson was another one who contributed to that anthology.
Give it a plug. I'm going to say it because you're not.
Well, I am, because it's Christina who ran that. It's called We've Seen the Same Horizon, available from Amazon and elsewhere, and I hope that you will buy a copy and be uplifted by the poetry therein. So, anyway, after that shameless bit of publicity, back to the film. So yes, coming back to the plot, although we've not really started looking at it, we sort of veered off a little bit there, as we generally do.
Well, I suppose all old original works suffer from the issue of modern works and writers so impressed by that old work, they make things that echo its ideas. So people going back to this might almost feel it's cliched, when in reality, obviously, it's the modern things that are cliched compared to it.
Yeah, this deals with eternal truths. So it's a love story in a sense.
You've got the oppressed class as well. You've got issues of the ruling class, how it deals with a working class. You've got the intrigue of the underground. You've got science deprived of reason and so on, and progress deprived of reason, things like that. You've got a lot of themes.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got the bourgeois who've delved into hedonism, completely detached from both, interestingly enough, they show a bourgeois class detached from the ruling class and mechanism, the actual ruler of the city, who you don't see acting like the CD club members, and neither does his assistants. And you've got at the bottom the workers, but in this sandwich, you've got this pacified, hedonistic class.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And it is, I suppose, very much like now. In a way, this theme has been around since really the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And this is very much based on, an industrial critique. But it's not a Marxist industrial critique.
No, because interesting enough, I was reminded of the Time Machine, obviously the late age when you see the Morlocks, etc. But of course the Morlocks were meant to represent, because it is ambiguous, because it's such a distance from obviously now, and the only people you actually get any real information from are these cow-like people who are completely useless.
Yes. Because Wells, he based the Time Machine, the Eloi and the Morlocks on the structure in one of these great houses, where the servants sort of basically spent their time working in the cellar area of the house, so all the kitchens were down below and everything. And then the bourgeois class obviously lived in the daylight and everything. That's why I go for it, because he actually, he was the daughter of I believe a scullery maid, if I remember rightly. He was the son of a scullery maid, if I remember rightly.
That would have been a bit scandalous.
and spent time in these in one of these great houses, and so that's where he got the idea from.
Fair enough.
Although interestingly, equally you could be right in a certain respect as well, because actually the servants' sleeping quarters were often in the attic. The attic was all done out into servants' quarters and so on. So there is a matter of interpretation there.
Yeah, and the way historically the people living above would have been the better educated and the ones in control. It's hard to imagine how the servants below would end up the ones which, although they were physically hideous, must have been at least more aware and controlling. It's a sort of reverse of two positions for it to be. It'd have to have a reverse of the intelligence and power and control, as well as the sort of position in society, who's on top.
Yeah, well, I think that the idea was that as the middle classes were becoming more decadent and so on, they would basically physically degenerate, as well as mentally.
Not inaccurate.
Yeah, this hasn't happened at all, has it? But interestingly, about the Morlocks as well, this was actually based on the word Moloch. Which is of course a Semitic demon, or started life as a god, I suppose, and then became sort of a demon as the Judeo-Christian mythos developed.
Probably some competitor that gets squashed underfoot.
Yeah, that's right. And there were sort of human sacrifices by flame. So cast into pits of fire and so on, in that kind of way. So they literally fed to Moloch. And so this is the idea of the Morlocks, of course, that these Eloi are fed to the Morlocks or Moloch.
What we see in this?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
That's what just that scene in particular just sort of felt like almost a reference to that, which could be possible because it's all within the right time frame to be referenced.
That's right. And what is interesting as well is that there was a book by Alexander Kuprin, who was a Russian writer. This was in 1896, which is a critique of industrialism and ruthless capitalism, and the book is called Moloch. And so this is obviously where all this comes from. And this was quite a theme, actually, of the period. So kind of late 1910s and 1920s, you got it recurring as a theme, which comes from that 1896 novel. And so you get mentions of it. D.H. Lawrence mentions, the Moloch of industry and so on, particularly in his novel The Rainbow. Also, you have the one of your chaps, actually, William McCance, this artist from, I believe he was born on the outskirts of Glasgow, if I remember rightly, and he created a very famous artwork called The Moloch of the Machine, or also called Machine Gods.
And of course, in the Steam Age, these kind of things would have been really all the more fitting. You imagine the flames, the coal, the steam and smoke.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a wonderful scene, actually, where you have this machine sort of reaching, going beyond the temperature that it's meant to be at, and because the worker just can't keep up because it's just too physically exhausting with the labor involved in keeping the machine running. And of course it explodes and kills various different workers. And then you have the scene where it's your Fedderson's son, Feder Fedderson, who is watching this scene as he's looking at what the workers do and everything. He's gone underground to see what the workers' conditions are like. And then he imagines it back to this god of the Ammonites, to whom are sacrificed all these people and so on. If I remember rightly, this is mentioned in the Bible, 2 Kings 23:10, if I remember rightly. My notes are correct.
I'll take your word for it.
Right. But anyway, yeah. But you wouldn't get that in a film these days. You wouldn't get that, that transition to this, from one thing to the other like that.
No, it's shown, really, it's like a poetical reference, just thrown in as a visual. It's something you'd expect in poetry, that kind of visual language or a written language now put on the screen to talk about more like, but it seamlessly transitions from a horrific scene to that. At most these days they might try and put in a bit of dialogue, and it would be sort of variable quality how they'd manage to slip that in, the reference, but to seamlessly blend in the surreal and imagination of the Feder, what he's sort of seeing, what he's comparing it to in his mind, not necessarily what he's actually seeing, but he's sort of, this is his emotion you're really seeing on the screen. It's a great idea, and I really wish more directors would be bold enough to do that. There's no harm in it. You don't have to. I know a lot of them talk about show, don't tell, and in this case, he is really showing and not telling, but he's also not assuming that means you have to have the constant baggage of realism. You don't need to say, oh, well, I'll have to show a scene where they get burned, and how will I explain why them getting burned is bad, and the social... Well, he didn't need to do that. He could just have this cultural reference, which is so dramatic and ingrained, even to the modern audience. You're going to understand what it's saying, even now, 80 years later.
Yeah, there's a lot of biblical referencing, actually, throughout, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, multiple. Obviously, the whole Babel thing's in there, and so on. There's many scenes where you'll see Egyptian references, obviously, in the cultural attire and the style of it. Yeah,
that's right. You get this sort of very much a Christian critique of industrialism that is somehow anti-Christian. And one of the things that is interesting, because of course you have the Maria character. Maria in Germany is Mary, of course. So she's like the Virgin Mary. And Feder falls in love with Mary, of course, and then because Mary is sort of this noble spirit who...
shepherdess of the poor.
That's right, yeah, shepherdess of the poor. Absolutely brilliant, yes. Those are the words. All the workers look up to her and so on, and she tells them that revolution is not the way forward and everything. And she also tries to shame the bourgeois class into looking after the workers and everything. She brings up those children, if you remember, into the lift and into the eternal gardens. Yeah, brings them into the eternal gardens where they're sort of scurrying after half-naked women and everything. Quite a bit of nudity in this, actually. I
was going to bring up, I was surprised how often you'll see like see-through dresses and you think, I can see her nips. 1927. Granted, she'll be is older than most of yours grands right now, but if you ignore that...
This is Weimar Germany, don't forget.
But you don't imagine a film set way back then having obvious, to any degree, nudity. You think that would have been too shocking for an audience?
But of course, as we have to remember that this is Weimar Germany, which was an ultra-liberal society. In many ways mirrors the society that we have now. But I don't think that the nudity in this film is egregious.
No, it's not. I wouldn't criticize it that way. But it was just surprising because you'd assume progression from a linear progression, shall I say, from now to the past that would be more. Maybe it's a wrong term, but sort of prudishness, or if you see what I mean.
Well, yeah, that is true. But I don't think you would have gotten away with that in, say, America or in Britain.
No, certainly not later on either.
But even in the 1920s in Britain or America, you would not have gotten away with that. I wonder, actually, if they censored those parts.
That's a good question. Because I know the written text, comics and so on, there was quite a lot in America. There was quite a lot of controversy with what started to come out. And then that's why they brought in things like the Comic Codes Authority and so on.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, in some ways that was a good thing because
it was starting
Marvel
to get
comics
disturbing.
There
was stuff in there that even now you would find you wouldn't want to show kids. It was disturbing stuff, bizarre fetishes and whatnot.
That's right, yeah. So, I believe in a certain amount of morality and everything. I think that art has to be moral, but I don't think it has to go overboard. I don't think it has to get to the point where such as the National Socialists wanted to censor everything.
Well, it's the same with this, although not to the same extreme. When the Comics Code Authority came in, because it's a backlash, what happens with these backlashes is they often overreach and go too far because they're so stunned and outraged they want to clean up everything. And obviously the most outraged and loudest people are often the most prudish and extreme in whatever political situation is. Much as we see today with the politics of the left, where the most loud people are the craziest and most extreme in that scene.
That's right. But this, of course, always ends up with an extreme in the other direction because you're being pushed from one extreme to the other because people overreact all the time. This is something that I want to get away from, actually, in many ways. So, as I say, I'm not a Puritan or anything like that. And I certainly think that the nudity in this particular film is in its place. And it has its place.
And perfectly justified thematically, because, as you said, this is their hedonistic totty den.
Yeah.
So, of course, you'd be wearing something like that.
Yeah.
And it's a stark contrast, of course. What do you see elsewhere? You see the boiler suits and the drudgery, and, of course, notably constantly masculine, non-sexual scenes, while the hedonistic people are surrounded by these feminine beauties.
That's right, yeah.
So it actually thematically and scene-wise works. It's all justified.
You can almost see as well the feminization of the middle classes by the fact that when Feder Feddersen goes down and he takes the place of that worker, and he realized that actually, even though he's the winner of that race up in the Eternal Gardens and so on, so he's the best of the elite, if you like, he doesn't have the physicality of a worker.
Because it's sort of pretend physicality he's been involved in.
Yeah, and so there is that difference in masculinity that comes out, and that the middle classes are becoming effete and
but
are
you'll see that even with,
physically.
You see that reflected even with Feder Senior's. He's ruling this place, but you'll see his staff are all incredibly timid, constantly frightened.
Yeah,
everybody's extremely deferential.
That's right. Although, of course, even the head of the workers. Grob, isn't it?
Grot?
Grot. Yeah. He.
Terrible name.
Yeah. He's very deferential as well.
Although with him, it was maybe, I don't know if it's a culture thing. With him, it was more understandable because he felt it was more like the working class man looking at his betters sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it was culturally more appropriate, while for the others, it felt more like it was from a position of weakness.
Yes, yeah, that's
because
right.
For two people on an equal level, if one's constantly bowing and scraping deferring, it's a weakness.
Well, your Feddersen, don't forget, he's the head of the city. He created all this city and everything. He is the kind of king, if you like, although he's not a king because he's a bourgeois. But yeah, it's this idea that he controls everything, although he doesn't control everything, of course, because he's having to have spies and so on to try to keep control.
And you see several moments where he's upset that he wasn't made aware of something that had happened. He fires one of his helpers for it.
That's right, yeah.
So he's not an all-knowing figure.
No, that's right. And he's almost like coming back to the biblical side of things, because, as I say, there are huge amounts of biblical referencing in this. The idea of a God that no longer cares about the world, this absenteeist God figure. Although one of the things I found interesting as well is because there's a tension between pagan ideas and Christian ideas in this, although paganism is often seen very negatively. You have, for example, this statue of Peder Fredriksson's mother, who's Jo Fedderson's wife, and formerly Rotvang the inventor's lover, and she's called Hel. Now, who is Hel in any mythology? Hel, one L.
Yeah.
Well, it's the goddess of the underworld of Germanic and Norse mythology. So, this is our tradition, of course.
Apparently, that was censored for the American market. It was a bit too close to the double L for them.
Was it? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't know how you would get around that. They must have cut that out. Well, supposedly we did cut a lot of it out for the foreign markets, but apparently that was considered too edgy.
Right. That completely destroys things because it negates Rotvang's motivation.
Yeah, they just cut whole scenes out apparently and just rewrote motivations. Because, cutting a film from 150 minutes to 90 minutes, you're not losing anything in the process.
No, not at all. But it's interesting that Rotvang as well, he's got a hand missing like Tyr, like the god Tyr, which he has sacrificed. In the Norse tradition, of course, Tyr puts his hand in the wolf, the Fenris wolf's mouth, and it's this idea that industry, that machinery is the wolf, but he has willingly sacrificed his hand for knowledge and to be able to create, but create in a way that is seen as unnatural. His idea is that he wants to bring back Hel from the dead, in being the goddess of the underworld and so on. But these are his motivations. But then of course, his idea changes to destroy Jo Feddersson.
It's fascinating to think of somebody blending Hel and Mary from two different religions together.
Yes, yeah, but of course these ideas were all going round in Weimar Germany. There was the coming back of pagan ideas and of neo-paganism and folkish ideas. Things like the GGG and the Mehrlicht movement, which were kind of neo-pagan artistic movements and cultural movements and so on, and occultist ideas as well. They were all kind of floating around, and this sort of blends them all together. But interestingly, the pagan and occultist ideas are thrown in with modernism, quite bizarrely, in a way, and so you get this robot who again becomes the Scarlet Whore of Babylon, which is extraordinary. And so you have this doubling, which again comes back to the Germanic doppelganger idea. So you have this folk legend of doppelganger, and you have the two Marias, and so one is sort of the Mother Mary or whatever.
Goodness and love.
Yes, and on the other side, you've got this machine likeness of her in the first robot put on screen, and also encompassing the idea of the Scarlet Whore of Babylon. Of course, she presents herself in Yoshiwara, where she's the dancing girl and everything that everyone lusts after. And she actually comes in like a scene from Revelation.
And of course, you also start seeing the diversity in that scene of corruption.
Absolutely, yeah. So diversity and corruption go together in this film. It's and people have missed that. This is not a film that sits very easily on the left,
but it can't be ignored.
Yeah, that's right. Interesting, of course, the word robot is not used because that comes later. This is Karel Čapek, of course, in the novel R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, who invents that. But in here, it's the Maschinenmensch, the machine person.
Mm.
But this is indeed the first robot on screen, who is, of course, it starts off as very mechanistic, but then is given the likeness of Maria, and to all intents and purposes looks like a real woman, looks exactly like Maria, and of course is played by the same actress, who plays a wonderful double role, actually, in complete opposites.
Yeah, that's some talent to do such a different character, all in the one film.
And did you notice, actually, that in the ending is that the robot is burned as a witch at the stake?
Yeah.
In front of a cathedral. And there is, of course, the fight between Freda Fredersen and Rotfang, which resembles extraordinarily the fight scene between Batman and the Joker in Tim Burton's Batman.
Yeah, there's some obvious inspiration there.
Yeah.
As they got that tower. Fantastic action scenes and crowd scenes in this. Give it some credit again. It's unbelievable when the floods are happening, so on, and you've got what folk are going to remember. There was no CGI when they have 1,000 people getting hit by a big wave of water. They had to get 1,000 people together and a big load of water and splash them with it.
Yeah,
and these people had to act soaking wet for hours on end.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting as well about Rotfang is that he lives in this incredibly archaic house. It's the last house in the city, it seems, that is of the old style, and yet inside is ultra futuristic. And I found that fascinating, actually, that you have that sort of blend of the ultra archaic and the ultra modernist, and this is the idea of sort of the pagan being the extremely old, and the coming back that will be the new. But of course, he's completely corrupt and immoral and so on. But I found that quite extraordinary. And of course, this is the idea of mixing occultist ideas with futurist ideas.
And in the scene where you see Fredersen Jr. exploring, looking for his lost love, there's a couple of scenes, I don't know if you remember, where he's looking around the room and it switches to a first-person view where you see the head pan around, and then not long after that, he's reaching for a piece of cloth, but the camera is actually following the hand, and you see the camera move. Nowadays, of course, it's nothing, but back then it was significant. You see the hand move with the camera moving behind the hand forward, as if it was attached to him. You know, like now you do with a head cam or something. I was really impressed to see that kind of inventive camera work in this. It reminded me, when we watched Birth of a Nation, the scene of the cavalry charge, which was filmed from behind a pickup or cart, however they did it, and the camera's moving, and the horses, of course, are moving towards you constantly, and the camera's keeping up with that movement. It's for back then, such a forward-thinking idea. It was really impressive to see this switch, a seamless switch to first-person view, including, as I say, the camera, which you expect, especially with the otherwise very theatrical stage play feeling. To switch to this first-person view, we see the hand and arm in front of the camera, and the camera's moving with the hand and arm as if it's your own first-person view. You don't expect that in especially such an old film.
Yeah, and actually there were a number of directors who went and actually watched the filming of this film. I believe a young Alfred Hitchcock was there, and Sergei Eisenstein both watched this film being made. And that says a lot about it. This was a big event. People knew about this. People knew how big this was, even before it hit the cinemas.
It's such a shame when you think of that, and then what its fate was to both be a financial disaster and to be butchered so heavily before it even got abroad, really.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, film producers, the people who are the heads of these companies and so on, are some of the worst people going for that. Apparently, there's looking at the Wicker Man. Now, Christopher Lee always said that there was a far better film that had been filmed before it was chopped to pieces. And apparently those scenes have been completely lost we shall never know how good a film that was, because it is still a very good film.
Yeah, it's a shame.
Yep. So, any last thoughts before we call it a day for this one?
Well, what do you think of course, the sort of, I suppose, boilerplate quote for the film, that the mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart?
Der Vermittler zwischen Herz und what is it? Zwischen Herz und Hand muss Vermittler sein. That's right, yes. Yes. Well, that's, of course, this idea that the middle class have become the head and the workers have become the hands, and that they've become divorced from each other. So it's actually, incredibly, that is a very anti-Christian sentiment, because Christians believe in the divorcing of the spirit and the body. And so all this problem, and it is really a problem of Western civilization in general. Bowden saw it before I did, Jonathan Bowden, of course, famous orator, where there are people who live for intellectual pursuits and people who live for bodily pursuits. And it is one of the great cancers of the Western world. But Christianity is not going to help that.
You've also got to remember the period this was set in, the kind of social upheaval that was going on. It was quite a nuanced criticism. This wasn't saying this, as some might, the sort of respect your betters and just listen, or time for the workers to do X, Y, Z sort of speech. This was quite a nuanced idea. It wasn't saying to destroy the intellectual elite and replace them with the workers. It was simply encouraging a sort of balance, a common sense, really.
Yeah, very much so. And this is, as I say, this is a very much an anti-Marxist view of industrialism.
Visually, it's highlighted by the shaking of hands, the meeting at the end when they're all agreeing to common sense. That does not line up with the sort of communist ideals. And folks should remember that at that time, you're talking about 10 years after the revolution in Russia.
Yes.
So
yeah,
this
very,
was
very
raw, hot news. This was not something that you're learning in a history book.
Yeah, it's very strange, actually, that Eisenstein was watching the making of this film, given that basically he made communist agitprop, essentially. Although, one or two of his films are quite Russian nationalist. Alexander Nevsky and so on. But but I think that this certainly offers a rightist perspective on how to deal with a lot of the problems we have in the West. Certainly there is a big antagonism between the middle class and the working class, and that they have very different ideas, very different cultural ideas, that we should try to understand each other a bit better. But equally, it's up to the middle class to mend their faults, because they have a lot. And one cannot have a society in which one embraces multiracialism, multiculturalism, and all-out decadence. And this is, of course, not to criticize all the middle class, because there are some very traditionalist and conservative people from the middle classes. But the leaders of leftist groups and so on certainly tend to come from bourgeois backgrounds, and have always done so, even going back, towards the English Civil War, which should really be the British Civil War.
When you look up the sort of the making of this, something that reminds you of what times were like when this was made was, in it you'll see a lot of very thin people, especially, I suppose, sadly, the kids. You'll see a lot of very thin kids, and you'll see a sort of comments when people are talking about the making of was, it was apparently very easy to find thousands of thin-looking homeless children very cheaply to appear as extras for the film. And I think you couldn't think of a much better sort of example of what times were like when this film was being made. It's a time that you just couldn't really imagine in most Western conditions. The idea that you could round up thousands of thin, hungry children on a whim for extras.
Although we are indeed seeing a degeneration in conditions among our own poor, actually, as we build up the people coming in from far and wide.
Yeah, in various countries there's this preference.
That's right. And the complete neglect of the poor on our own doorstep.
When you look at these examples of the past, there's nothing to stop these things repeating. But I just thought it was interesting to see the context a film's made in. It's worth understanding the world that he was making this film for.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in a lighter-hearted note, there's a sort of... I like it as much as it annoys me, but IMDb website, that sometimes you'll see really interesting and useful things, and other times you'll see the biggest load of shit you can imagine written on there, and it just stays. It just somehow these things, nonsense statements, can just linger forever. And in this particular case, it was one I remember seeing some time ago for Metropolis, so I went back to see if it was still there, and it is. So I've written it down, and it's in the goof section, where it describes that there's several scenes, including the underground and in the offices, where you see the 10-hour clock, and that's part of the theme, is this 10-hour clock. Of course, the idea is it's duplicitous. People are tricked into this idea that they're only working X number of hours, but in reality, we're still in a real life of having 24 hours in one day. But it says, so there's these 10-hour clocks above ground, but then the ruler of the city looks at his watch and it says 12 hours on it, so that's a goof. And I couldn't believe that somebody had actually sat and watched this film and thought that the fact that the ruler of the city has a 12-hour watch was a goof.
No, it's not a goof.
No, it's not. It's incredibly deliberate, even for the fact that when you look at the clocks, it even shows a smaller clock above with our normal time above it.
That's right, because the workers work 10-hour shifts, 10 hours on, 10 hours off.
Which in reality, of course, is not 10 hours. It's a trick. But this person has watched this, and somehow it's just completely gone above them. But this is now written on IMDb for what must be a year or something.
No, I personally think that the workers work 10 hours and then have 10 hours off and then go back 10 hours again. Because you see, there's no night and day below ground.
I thought it was meant to show some sort of trick, like they're actually working, let's say, 12 hours or what. But
it could be. That is one interpretation. I read it to the fact that the people above ground were on normal time and the people below ground were on basically a new time based on 10 hours.
Which is interesting because, of course, it hints at the digital almost, which precedes the digital age, but this is the people that are slaves to 10.
Yeah, that's right, the metric system.
Machines, metric, and so on, which was all just about to come in.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
But allegedly that's a goof, so there you go.
This is exactly what we keep saying about critics, that they know absolutely bugger all.
You don't trust a critic before you've watched or experienced whatever it is, and even then, you've got to think about what they're saying. Even us, I mean, we've always said that anyway. But you get something. That's just a particularly egregious example of utter nonsense.
Yes, absolutely right. And these people get paid. A lot of these critics.
Some of them.
Dear, oh dear, absolutely terrible. And yet. We've got, 160 viewers. But we love you all out there.
Speaking of which, of course, pass us about to your friends on social media, subscribe and so on, because YouTube constantly, and check to see if you are subscribed, if you are watching this, because YouTube constantly unsubscribes people. It constantly tries to block videos from appearing in your lists. It's all very petty and silly, but they do it just to try and keep the numbers go down. We get 10 subscribers and then 10 vanish suddenly. They do it with other people as well. It's a ridiculous game, but the only way around it is if you, the viewer, if you enjoy this at all, or if you like some of the ideas, to try and pass it about. We don't have any budget to try and force this like an advertising department, because it is just people doing this at home. But if you can pass it about, it'd be much appreciated.
Excellent. And I think that's a great note to end things on. So, I say thank you to you, James.
No bother.
And we'll see you all next time.